Honourable Senator Gold, seconded by the Honourable Senator Laboucan Benson, that pursuant to Section 58 of the May I Dispense? On debate, Senator Gold.
Thank you, Your Honour. Honourable Senators, it's with a profound sense of responsibility that I rise today to speak to the motion before us. For the first time since it was passed in 1988, on Monday, February 14th, 2022, the Government of Canada invoked the Emergencies Act to proclaim the existence of a public order emergency in Canada. Last night, our elected colleagues in the other place approved the government's decision, thereby maintaining the additional authorities under the Act. I might add, because I believe it is material to the decision before us, that the other place's consent was given with the support of the New Democratic Party. As government representative in the Senate, it is my responsibility to explain to the Senate why the government has invoked the Act and to seek the Senate's confirmation so that the Act can continue to apply in the coming days under our supervision. I do so with humility, but I also do so with the firm conviction, confirmed by the events of the past 7 days, that the government had reasonable grounds to invoke the Act. As we begin our debate, I would like to start by thanking the law enforcement professionals who have been working day and night to bring peace back to the streets of Ottawa and to thwart emerging plans for new blockades, ensuring that blockades of critical infrastructure stop metastasizing across our country. And as we stand on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, I also want to pay tribute to all who call Ottawa home, citizens who have been besieged for weeks by folks who have not respected the rule of law or the democratic institutions that our national capital represent. As senators, the people of Ottawa host us every week. They lodge us in hotels around the Hill. They feed us in restaurants, at the Senate cafeteria, or even the Rideau Centre. They staff our offices. They do the hard work of ensuring that our democratic institutions can always function, even in a pandemic, even in a blockade. They keep us safe, and no one should fear coming to work in this place. People of Ottawa deserve their freedom, freedom to live their lives, free from assault, free from fear, free from harassment, free from crime, free from chaos. I know that the citizens of Ottawa have our backs. With extraordinary measures having been in place for little over 1 week, we in the Senate are now called upon to concur with our elected colleagues and accept the government's initial decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. Should we do so, we will then bear the weighty responsibility, together with our House colleagues, to act as a check, to monitor, to supervise, and to adjudicate the uses of the Act. As parliamentarians, we are now called upon to determine whether the government has satisfied the terms of the Act, such that the measures taken pursuant to it may remain in effect until they are no longer required. Today, however, we have the benefit, the luxury, the benefit of hindsight. We take our decisions during an unprecedented and multifaceted law enforcement operation in which the tools created under the Act are being used effectively to bring this emergency to a successful end as quickly but as peaceably as possible. As we have seen, the impact of the Act has been pivotal. We know it is making the difference because those implementing the operation are telling us so and are asking us to keep it in place so that we do not squander the progress that has been made. In many ways, we are deciding whether our government and our law enforcement agencies across Canada can continue to use the tools that, so far at least, have turned the tide and shifted momentum back into the camp of law and order. Now we decide whether we allow these measures to continue so that Canadians can effectively put this chapter behind us and begin a process of healing.
Honourable Senators, the government has declared a state of emergency. Once the declaration is made, special temporary measures can be implemented to respond to the emergency. Any measures taken under the Act must be exercised in accordance with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and must be carefully tailored to limit any impact on charter rights to what is reasonable and proportionate in the circumstances. In order to support senators and ensure that they are well informed, our office organized 2 technical briefings, made ministers available to answer senators' questions, and circulated and tabled all documents required under Section 58 of the Emergency Measures Act. It is essential that the Act also provide for rigorous parliamentary oversight and review at every stage of the process, a matter to which I will return later.
We outline the temporary measures that have been put in place to date, both under the Emergencies Act and the regulations promulgated thereunder. These measures were carefully chosen and designed to respond to the situation, to fill gaps in provincial and local authorities and capacity. I would summarize these measures as follows. Measures to temporarily regulate and prohibit public assemblies that lead to a breach of the peace and go beyond lawful protest. Measures to temporarily designate and secure places where blockades are to be prohibited. This could include borders, approaches to borders, other critical infrastructure, the parliamentary precinct in Ottawa, or other places where there is evidence of an imminent unlawful assembly. Measures to temporarily authorize or direct any person to render essential services to relieve impacts of blockades on Canada's public and economic safety, and for those persons to be fairly compensated for that work. Colleagues, this has made it possible to remove many of the large trucks that have blocked access to the parliamentary precinct and have imposed unacceptable hardships on the residents in the area. Measures to temporarily limit financial support for unlawful assemblies, notably through the temporary cessation of service from financial institutions and the application of reporting requirements to crowdfunding platforms. Measures to temporarily enable the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaws and provincial offences where required, and the imposition of fines or imprisonment for contravention of certain orders or regulations made under Section 19 of the Emergencies Act. All these measures have been used effectively and in a responsible and respectful manner, as we have seen and are seeing in Ottawa. Let me turn now to the provisions of the Act setting out the criteria for invoking a public order emergency. The government is firmly of the view that it has met the legal threshold outlined in the Act. To lawfully invoke the Act, the legislation requires that the government have reasonable grounds that a public order emergency exists. Based on all the facts and evidence at its disposal, the government believes that it has such reasonable grounds, and that is why the Act has been invoked. Allow me to outline for the Chamber the relevant provisions of the Act, which, as you will see, point to a highly fact-driven analysis. And I will subsequently elaborate on the facts, contexts, and circumstances that can be disclosed that have led the government to the conclusion that the Act had to be invoked. Section 17 of the Act is the most crucial. It provides as follows, and I'm quoting, "When the Governor and Council believes on reasonable grounds that a public order emergency exists and necessitates the taking of special temporary measures for dealing with the emergency, the Governor and Council, after such consultation as is required by Section 25, may by proclamation so declare." The criteria defining what constitutes a public order emergency under the Act are highly contextual. Section 16 of the Act defines a public order emergency as, and I quote, "an emergency that arises from threats to the security of Canada and that is so serious as to be a national emergency." Close quote. The Act therefore requires the government to have a belief rooted in reasonable grounds that there exists an emergency arising from, again I quote from the Act, "threats to the security of Canada," and that it considers, again on the basis of reasonable grounds, that those threats amount to a, quote, "national emergency." Now, the concept of threats to the security of Canada is defined in Section 2 of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act, and it includes the following activities. Under Section 2B, foreign influenced activities within or relating to Canada that are detrimental to the interests of Canada and are clandestine or deceptive or involve a threat to any person. Section 2C, activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purposes of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada or a foreign state. And Section 2D, activities directed towards undermining by covert unlawful acts or directed towards or intended ultimately to lead to the destruction or overthrow by violence of the constitutionally established system of government in Canada. Meanwhile, the concept of national emergency is defined in the Emergencies Act as, and I quote, an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that A, seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians, and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, or seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial of Canada, and that cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. Based on all the facts at its disposal, the government has reasonable grounds to believe that over the course of the past few weeks, the threats posed by the convoy movement has amounted to this. I would underscore in passing that some provinces requested assistance or explicitly expressed that the situation went beyond their capacity to deal with it, including Ontario and Alberta. In fact, over the course of the past weeks, a range of local authorities, from municipalities to police chiefs to provincial premiers, stated that they did not have sufficient capacity to act at various points in time. In invoking the Emergencies Act, the federal government is responding to the assessments of those levels of authority. I, for one, would be astounded, if not indeed flummoxed, if a court ever deemed that, despite all of the public statements and requests for assistance we have seen, that the local authorities had the capacity to deal with the situation in an effective manner. I would also note that while one may argue that the situation could have been dealt with, with other laws, one would be hard-pressed to make the case that the situation could have been dealt with effectively, which is what the Act talks about. Here, the benefit of hindsight is very helpful. We now have seen how ineffectively the situation was managed without the Emergencies Act, and how effectively the situation has improved since it has been invoked a week ago. We also have every reason to believe that the Emergencies Act remains necessary for Canada to be able to respond to ongoing threats to re-establish blockades of critical infrastructure or border crossings. Law enforcement agencies are currently relying on the Act to set up secured areas in downtown Ottawa and at border crossings, preventing foreign money from continuing to fund illegal blockades and ensuring that our borders remain open. Yes, the Windsor Bridge and the Coutts border crossing were eventually cleared, but at what cost? And as the discovery of weapons and body armor reveals, at what risk to law enforcement and the public? And indeed, the Emergencies Act has played a crucial role in ensuring that the situation is brought under control, avoiding a renewed spread of blockades by occupiers and their sponsors looking for a new target. I will now endeavour to provide senators with further context and factors that have led the government to conclude that there are sufficiently reasonable grounds to believe there is a public order emergency, that is, an emergency arising from threats to the security of Canada that is so serious as to be a national emergency. I would note that this is a highly factual and contextual question, which necessarily relies upon information that may not be shared in the context of our debates. And in that regard, I think the government is owed a certain degree of deference vis-à-vis the security assessment it has made. I would also note that the position of the government is elaborated in one of the documents tabled in the Senate Monday and shared with all senators last week, entitled February 14th, 2022 Declaration of Public Order Emergency, Explanation Pursuant to Section 58(1) of the Emergencies Act. As the document states, and I quote, "The Freedom Convoy 2022 was the first manifestation of this growing movement centered on anti-government sentiments related to the public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Trucker convoys began their journey from various points in the country, and the movement arrived in Ottawa on Friday, January 28, 2022. Since then, the movement has only continued to gain momentum across the country, with significant increase in numbers in Ottawa, as well as protests and blockages spreading to different locations, including strategic points of entry, example, Ambassador Bridge, Ontario, Coutts, Alberta, and Emerson, Manitoba. And later on, the document continues, and I quote, "The movement has moved beyond a peaceful protest, and there is significant evidence that illegal activity is underway," close quote. Colleagues, the ongoing occupation of downtown Ottawa by the so-called Freedom Convoy held the city and its residents hostage for 3 weeks. Far from being peaceful, they caused considerable harm to the city and its residents. There was evidence of destructive, racist, and violent behavior. Small businesses endured illegal obstruction of their neighborhoods and harassment of their patrons and staff. The convoy's rhetoric was toxic, dangerous, and at times hateful. Swastikas, Confederate flags, and other odious symbols of anti-Semitism and white supremacy are disgraceful and unacceptable, yet they also played a role. The calls to topple our democratically elected government and its institutions by relying upon a show of force in our nation's capital were evident and encouraged by the extremist entities. There were incidents of threats, an attempt to set fire to an apartment building, and the need for police protection for a brave young woman who sought and won an injunction against constant noise in a downtown core. Moreover, across the country, the blockades we saw at borders in multiple provinces harmed our economy and endangered public safety. For example, near Morden, Manitoba, because of a convoy blocking traffic, it took over an hour for a woman in her 80s suffering from chest pains to get to the hospital. After the federal government announced its intention to invoke the Emergencies Act, and in the days since, many of these blockades resolved. But the situation across Canada remains volatile and unpredictable, and the possibility of further blockages and other illegal activities has not disappeared, as is evidenced in Quebec City and in Surrey, BC this past weekend. Colleagues, the negative economic impact of all these activities cannot be overstated. Cities, especially on Ottawa, have spent millions of taxpayer dollars battling the situation. More broadly, these occupations and blockades had and continue to have adverse effects on the Canadian economy, an economy that's still recovering from the impacts of the pandemic. Critical supply chains have been disrupted, and this is hurting many Canadians, including workers who rely on cross-border trade for their livelihood. The blockades have adversely affected Canada's relationship with our trading partners, particularly the United States. There have been breakdowns in the distribution and availability of essential goods, services, and resources to Canadians. These demonstrations have raised the levels of unrest and violence in our country to unacceptable levels, threatening our safety and security. Indeed, there is clear evidence that some participants in these activities are prepared to use violent means to achieve their goals. We have heard reports of threats of force to oppose removal of the blockades. The recent seizure by the RCMP of a cache of firearms with a large quantity of ammunition in Coutts, Alberta, and evidence that some protesters are alleged to have conspired to murder RCMP officers are troubling examples of this fact. Demonstrators across the country, emboldened by the blockades and the occupation of our nation's capital, have made clear that their objective is to force the government to remove all COVID-related measures or to overthrow our democratically elected government, potentially by force. Colleagues, what began as a protest against vaccine mandates for truckers at the border morphed into a joining of forces of all those opposing the mandates, truly, really all public health measures by all levels of government, and those wanting to destabilize the government through outside foreign influence, and those angry about the results of the last election and who are determined to overturn it. The Memorandum of Understanding put forward by Canada Unity called for our duly elected government to be replaced. And I quote from the Memorandum of Understanding. In this case, it reads, "The parties are the people of Canada, the Senate of Canada, and the Governor-General of Canada, the highest authorities representing the federal government. The matter to be discussed and agreed upon is this: the Senate of Canada and the Governor-General, combined, referred to as the federal government, are to uphold and enforce all Canadian and international human rights laws that are clearly laid out in the MOU, or resign their lawful positions of authority immediately." Close quote. The founders of Canada Unity are the same people who have also called for charges of treason to be leveled against the Prime Minister, and they are some of the first organizers of the convoy to Ottawa. Another organizer and folk hero of the convoy has stated publicly that COVID-19 is a man-made bioweapon and warned of a, quote, endgame to depopulate the Anglo-Saxon race, close quote. In December, while talking of public health measures on his live stream, he said, and I quote, "The only way this is going to be solved is with bullets," close quote. In its 2020 report, CSIS states the following, quote, "Some violent extremists view COVID-19 as a real but welcome crisis that could hasten the collapse of Western society," close quote. CSIS is so concerned about these groups that it has elevated ideological violent extremism to the highest threat to Canada, ahead of religious extremism and groups like Al-Qaeda. The crowdfunding site Give, Send, Go was hacked, and a list of donors was made public. Of those who donated to the illegal protest in Ottawa, there are reports that more than 300 donations came from the Oath Keepers, the group that participated in the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. In Coutts, Alberta, along with the seized firearms and ammunition, there was body armor with the insignia of a group called Diagolon. According to Candice Kelschel, an expert from the Justice Institute of British Columbia, Diagolon's purpose is to, and I quote, incite a race war. This weekend, there were reports that members of Diagolon posted on social media the names of police officers who have been helping give the residents their city back. And let's remember that the charges laid in Coutts include conspiracy to murder police officers. These are but a few examples of the threats that Canada faces, not only in Ottawa, but wherever a regrouping may be planned via social media. Honourable Senators, even if the initial intent of the convoy was to come to Canada and express displeasure about border vaccine mandates, these efforts were co-opted by extremist elements who used good faith protesters as a Trojan horse to advance their nefarious intentions. It is a matter of public record that there have been threats of serious violence against persons or property, including critical infrastructure, for the purpose of achieving a political or ideological objective within Canada. This alone satisfies the definition of a threat to the security of Canada, which is a key element of a public order emergency as defined by Section 16 of the Act. The other element is that this threat to our security must rise to the level of a national emergency as defined in Section 3 of the Act. As I've already outlined, it is clear that the convoys and blockades pose a serious danger to Canadians, and has become evident over 3 long weeks. As blockades became entrenched and started spreading across the country, provincial and municipal law enforcement were unable to effectively enforce the law in their jurisdictions within a reasonable time frame. For example, despite invoking provincial emergency measures, Ontario did not have the ability to compel service from towing companies, which was one of the main challenges both in Ottawa and on the Ambassador Bridge. In Windsor, tow trucks from Michigan came north to help out. But that's not an option elsewhere or everywhere. Under the Emergencies Act, the federal government enacted measures to overcome this challenge. Also, no province or territory acting alone could effectively cut off financial support for the blockades. Some provincial service providers are provincially regulated, but each province can only regulate its own, and banks are federally regulated. Under the Emergencies Act, the federal government has been able to target the funding that was paying for the food and the fuel sustaining the blockades. But that is not all. As outlined in the document tabled yesterday, the blockades and protests threaten the security of Canada's borders, with the potential to endanger the ability of Canada to manage the flow of goods and people across the border, and the safety of CBSA officers, and to undermine the trust and coordination between CBSA officials and their American partners. Additional blockades are anticipated. This has been a national crisis beyond the capacity of any single province or territory to address. And while after this weekend we hope we're turning a corner, we are by no means out of the woods. For this reason, the federal government has stepped in and used the legal tools at its disposal to address this unique situation. This unprecedented step of invoking the Emergencies Act is being taken in response to an unprecedented state of affairs. These measures are necessary to bring an end to the illegal activities and blockades and to deter their repetition. As stated by our colleague, Senator Vern White, and former Cabinet Minister Peter MacKay in their joint article for the National Post, from which I quote, "What we have seen in the occupation of Ottawa and blockages at border crossings is not the right of protest enshrined in our Constitution, but illegal activity that represents a national security and economic threat to Canada," close quote. Law enforcement professionals, from Senator White to the Canadian Police Association and the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, have been clear in recent days that the emergency orders have been a key factor in the progress we've seen in Ottawa. And Michael Kempa, Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Ottawa, has made clear that, and I quote, "Once the protests took possession of downtown space, once rights for others were infringed by the illegal protests and illegal protesters, once it expanded to include border crossings affecting the economy, it became a national emergency when it threatened the stability of the economy and rights of others. Municipal, provincial governments did not have the power or the resources," close quote. Chers collègues,
Dear colleagues, the government took the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act seriously. This decision was made following a careful assessment of the situation across the country. Ongoing engagement with public servants and law enforcement across the country, and extensive discussions during 3 meetings of the Cabinet Incident Response Group on February 10th, 12th, and 13th, 2022. Prior to invoking the Act, the government also consulted with the provincial and territorial premiers as required under Section 25 of the Emergencies Act. Several premiers, including Premier Doug Ford, expressed their inability to manage blockades and occupations and called on the government to act and support the decision. Other premiers felt they had the tools to manage the situation in their province. A report of these consultations, as well as a summary of commitments between the government and other provincial and municipal officials, was tabled in the Senate on Monday and distributed to all senators last week. The invocation of the Emergency Measures Act was deemed necessary to provide additional tools to law enforcement and other institutions to respond to the emergency. And they are still needed, even though the situation in Ottawa seems to have greatly improved.
As interim Ottawa Police Chief Steve Bell stated during his news conference of February 18th, and I quote, "The 3 levels of government have come together to support our efforts in this, have led us to be able to have the success we're starting to see right now. The Emergency Measures Act, the Provincial Emergency Act, as well as the City of Ottawa emergency and injunction that have been provided, have created the ability for us to use powers and use new and existing powers to be able to properly deal with the demonstration to ultimately bring it to an end. Without the authorities that have been provided to us through these pieces of legislation, we wouldn't be able to do the work we are doing today," close quote. Colleagues, the blockades and assemblies are not isolated incidents, nor are they spontaneous. There is evidence of coordination between the various convoys and blockades. There's also evidence of significant funding and other support being provided by those connected to far-right extremist groups, both in Canada and elsewhere. The measures authorized under the Emergencies Act are required to stabilize the situation and to ensure that further illegal activities and blockades do not continue. Let me turn to several issues and questions that have been raised about the Act and the measures that have been authorized by it. The first concerns the application of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter applies to the Emergencies Act and to all actions taken pursuant to the Act. There is no temporary suspension of rights or freedoms as there was under the Old War Measures Act. Furthermore, all acts must be consistent with our international human rights obligations. But don't take it from me. Take it from Ed Broadbent, the former leader of the New Democratic Party, who yesterday said that, and I quote, "Compared to the War Measures Act, the Emergency Act has reduced powers, added significant parliamentary review, and was created in part to support and uphold the Charter. And this is one of the key reasons," he says, "that the Emergency Act is different. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is not suspended. There is parliamentary oversight, and the Act would expire in its application after 30 days. Close quote. Along these lines, Professor Kempa explains as follows, and I quote, "The Emergencies Act is simply not the War Measures Act. The War Measures Act, you flip a switch on and off, on or off, and when you turn it on, it suspends everybody's civil liberties across Canada. The Emergencies Act does not work that way. It is an incremental act that works within the Charter, and the government takes existing laws, puts them together, and amps them up for a period of time, and it has only been applied to people who are either directly involved in the illegal protest or who are supporting the illegal protest. It has not otherwise affected Canadians across the country. A much better law than the old-fashioned War Measures Act," close quote. Now, because the proclamation is not legislative in nature, no charter statement was produced. Nevertheless, let me say the following. The Charter guarantees rights and freedoms subject to reasonable limits that are prescribed by law and can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. There is no doubt that freedoms of assembly and expression are fundamental to Canada's democratic society. And in particular, freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly ensure that Canadians of diverse experience, perspective, and opinion have an opportunity to make themselves heard and to contribute to public discourse. Nothing in these measures negates this opportunity. Section 2 of the Emergency Measures Regulations provides specificity on illegal public assemblies that may lead to breach of the peace. This narrow limitation is measured and limited in time. Canadians have expressed their freedom to assemble peacefully during the pandemic, whether to support or oppose public health measures or to take positions on other causes, as they continue to have that freedom. However, these illegal occupations and blockages have been intimidating, harassing, and pose an ongoing threat to Canada's security and Canada's economy. They do not aim to contribute to a public debate, but rather to dominate it through intimidation and physical force. These actions are beyond what any free and democratic society should be expected to tolerate. It bears repeating. The Emergencies Act cannot be invoked to respond to peaceful protest, which is protected by our Charter, nor even to respond to unlawful protests that can, in the ordinary course, be controlled by provincial or local authorities. But the organized occupations and blockages in multiple places across our country in recent weeks bear no resemblance to peaceful protests and go well beyond the kinds of civil disobedience that we've seen in other contexts. The emergency measures are carefully tailored to the underlying objective of responding to the national emergency and restoring public order. While some of these measures, notably those set out in the second regulation promulgated pursuant to the Declaration, may engage privacy rights under the Charter, and I should add that the terms of the Privacy Act still apply, the measures are designed to strike a reasonable balance between privacy and the objective of addressing the public order emergency. And finally, the Act does not oust the jurisdiction or limit the jurisdiction of the court to address claims that rights and freedoms were infringed. Indeed, as we know, there already are proceedings that have been initiated to that effect. La deuxième question.
The second issue I wish to raise concerns the geographic scope of the proclamation and the measures, and the fact that several provincial premiers are opposed to the application of the Act in their province. The Act is federal legislation. Therefore, it has a legal application across the country. However, the government has been very clear that not all of the measures available under the Act will be used, and that the measures that are used will only be used when they are needed.
Canadians in towns, cities, and provinces where there are no ongoing blockades or occupations will likely see nothing arising from the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Even in places where there are ongoing occupations, if municipal and provincial law enforcement do not require federal assistance or the additional tools provided under the Emergencies Act to restore order, they need not use them. The ultimate goal for the government is to end all the illegal occupations and blockades. Local and provincial authorities were unable to resolve these incidents in the weeks leading up to the declaration of a public order emergency. Since the intention to declare a public order emergency was announced, many situations have been successfully resolved, both in Ottawa, where police use the emergency powers explicitly and effectively, and elsewhere, where perhaps the invocation of the Emergencies Act sent a message to some participants that it was time to go home. This is good news. This is the Act achieving its intended purpose. The third issue concerns the measures surrounding the funding of unlawful activities. Temporary measures under the Emergencies Act direct Canadian financial institutions to review their relationships with anyone actively participating or actively supporting the illegal occupations and blockades. On a temporary basis, a bank or other financial service provider can immediately freeze or suspend an account without a court order. In so doing, they are protected against civil liability for actions taken in good faith. And this order covers both personal and corporate accounts. To quote Michael Kempa again, quote, "The freezing of accounts motivated a huge number of people to leave, and it couldn't be done without the Emergencies Act," close quote. The actions in Ottawa may be the best example, but it is by no means the only example of the need for funding in order to continue and maintain a blockade or a long-term incursion. Those individuals or businesses that contribute to illegal occupations and prolong the illegality will and should suffer the consequences. Moreover, crowdfunding and payment service providers being used to raise funds for the protest must register with the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre, FINTRAC, Canada's main monitor for money laundering and terrorist financing, and they must report large and suspicious transactions. While this is a temporary measure, the government has signaled that it intends to introduce legislation to apply FINTRAC reporting requirements to crowdfunding platforms on a permanent basis. Also under the emergency orders, federal government institutions may share relevant information about persons and entities participating and supporting unlawful assemblies with banks and other financial service providers where it will help stop the funding of illegal activities under the regulations. Following the money is an important step that will help put an end to these illegal blockades and protests. The questions have been raised about how these measures will be applied and what protections or safeguards exist to protect Canadians who have had their bank accounts frozen or their insurance suspended. The order requires financial service providers to review on an ongoing basis whether their customers are participating in or funding unlawful assemblies. The intent is that if you stop participating in the protest, the bank unfreezes your account. This is meant to incentivize people to stop making contributions or to drive their truck away from a blockade and go home. As such, it is in the government's interest for those who make that sensible choice to have their account unfrozen quickly. Colleagues, these temporary financial measures are not being applied indiscriminately. Let me quote the February 21st, 2022 RCMP statement on the freezing of financial accounts. Quote, "Under the Emergency Economic Measures Order, Emergencies Act, the list that was provided to financial institutions included identities of individuals who were influencers in the illegal protest in Canada and owners and or drivers of vehicles who did not want to leave the area impacted by the protest. At no time did we provide a list of donors to financial institutions. We are now working with the banks to build a process to address the accounts that were frozen." Close quote. Now, if someone feels that a mistake has been made or believes they are being treated unjustly, there are a number of steps that they can take. First, they can reach out directly to their bank or to police to demonstrate that they're no longer participating in a blockade. And this alone should be enough to have their account unfrozen. If there's an exceptional case, where that doesn't work, the person can make a complaint to the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. And ultimately, Canadians have recourse to the courts. But it's highly unlikely that this will be necessary. The purpose of this short-term emergency order is for people to have their accounts frozen while they're actively participating in the blockades, and to have them unfrozen as soon as their participation stops. Importantly, these measures related to bank accounts do not apply retroactively. Let me be clear. This order does not apply to people who made donations or who participated in the blockades before February 15th. It's worth noting, colleagues, that as of Sunday, some 200 bank accounts have been frozen out of tens of thousands of donors and participants. So it certainly does not appear that this measure is being overused. Finally, let me address the concern that the invocation of the Emergency Act sets a dangerous precedent for future governments who might be tempted to use it to shut down Indigenous protests or protests by environmental activists. The Emergency Act has been on the books since 1988, and this is the first time it has been invoked. As the Prime Minister has said many times this past week, it is not a tool of first resort or second, it's a tool of last resort. Of course, there is no way to predict what a future government might do in the face of a perceived national emergency. But if the Act is invoked, all actions must be consistent with the constitutionally protected rights guaranteed by the Charter, and the courts will be there to protect those whose rights and freedoms may be infringed. Equally importantly, the Act requires rigorous democratic oversight if it is invoked, and ongoing oversight and review even after the temporary measures it authorized are no longer in effect. And it is to these democratic mechanisms that I now turn. A distinguishing feature of the Emergency Act is the comprehensive way in which it contemplates and structures parliamentary oversight and review of all stages in the process once a government declares the existence of a national emergency. The first step is the one with which we are seized. Under Section 58 of the Act, both the Senate and the House of Commons must begin debate on a motion to confirm the declaration within 7 days after its issuance. And as stated at the outset, the legal test is whether the government had reasonable grounds to believe that a public order emergency exists, necessitating the imposition of special temporary measures for dealing with the emergency, if either the House or the Senate If either the House or the Senate votes not to confirm the declaration is revoked effective that day, and all the measures previously authorized cease to be in force. But that is not all. The Act also provides parliamentarians the tools to move that a declaration of emergency be revoked even after having initially confirmed it, as set out in Section 59 of the Act. At any time after the declaration of a national emergency, a motion seeking the revocation of a declaration of emergency, if signed by 10 senators or 20 members of the House, may be filed with the Speaker. And that motion must be taken up and considered within 3 days after the motion is filed. Colleagues, this provides parliamentarians the ability to challenge the continuation of the emergency measures if they deem the emergency to have passed. A similar power is granted with respect to orders or regulations made pursuant to a declaration. With the exception of those orders or regulations exempt from publication in the Canada Gazette by regulations made under the Statutory Instruments Act, all orders and regulations must be laid before each House of Parliament within 2 sitting days after they're promulgated. Section 61 of the Act provides a process whereby a motion to revoke or amend a regulation or order must be filed with the Speaker and taken up within 3 sitting days. In these ways, the Act provides further recourse for parliamentarians to reconsider whether the emergency measures should continue and to vote to terminate them even before the 30-day period elapses. Furthermore, if the government wishes to extend the state of emergency beyond the 30-day limit prescribed in the Act, Section 60 provides that the extension must be confirmed by both the Senate and the House in the same manner and within the same time frames as when it was invoked initially. But there's even more. Section 63 of the Act also provides for the establishment of a parliamentary review committee of both houses of Parliament to review the declaration of emergency and to report back to both houses of Parliament. This committee has the responsibility to report the results of its review at least once every 60 days while the declaration of emergency is in force. However, in cases where there is a motion for the revocation of the declaration, it must report to Parliament within 3 days. Where a proclamation continuing the declaration is issued, or where a declaration has expired or been revoked, the committee must report within 7 sitting days. The review and reporting functions of this committee are crucial to enhance democratic accountability. This will allow senators and our colleagues in the House to stay apprised of how decisions were made, to assess what worked and what didn't, to reflect upon the lessons learned, and to inform future actions. The roles and responsibilities of this committee also provide ongoing oversight of the measures taken pursuant to the declaration. For example, where a regulation or order is exempted from publication in the Canada Gazette, that order or regulation shall be referred to the committee within 2 days after it is made, or if the committee has not yet been constituted, within the first 2 sitting days after it is designated or established. Should this be the case, the committee will have 30 days to amend or revoke them. Amend or revoke them. This is another mechanism to ensure ongoing democratic review and oversight of the measures taken under a declaration of emergency. And I wish at this time to advise this chamber that there currently are no orders or regulations expected to be made that would be referred to the committee, meaning that have not been deposited or would be deposited publicly before both houses of Parliament. The Act is silent as to when the Parliamentary Review Committee is to be established. That said, the establishment of the committee would follow the usual rules for standing up joint committees. Accordingly, if the declaration of emergency is confirmed, I will be working with my counterpart in the House to move as quickly as possible to get the committee constituted. Now, regarding membership on the committee, the Act is silent as to its size, nor does it say how many members should be senators and how many members should be members of the House of Commons. Section 62(1) provides only that the committee shall include, quote, at least one member of the House of Commons from each party that has a recognized membership of 12 or more persons in that House, and at least one senator from each party in the Senate that is represented on the committee by a member of the House of Commons, close quote. It does not preclude the naming of additional categories of members, whether from the House or the Senate. After the expiration, without extension, or the revocation of the Act, Section 63(1) states, and I quote, the Governor and Council shall, within 60 days after the expiration or revocation of a declaration of emergency, cause an inquiry to be held into the circumstances that led to the declaration being issued and the measures taken for dealing with the emergency. Close quote. Colleagues, the questions and the concerns leading up to the invocation of the Emergencies Act are far too numerous to list, and many are not even yet known. But Section 63(1) will allow a committee to thoroughly investigate the how, the who, the what, the when, and the why leading up to the decision. How did this movement begin and gain momentum? Who coordinated and organized the protest? What was the catalyst for its inception? When did the anger explode, and why was the illegal response of blockades and occupations considered the remedy? The actions of governments at all levels, as well as the actions or inactions of law enforcement, will also need review. This review will begin within 60 days of the termination of the order, and a report must be tabled within 360 days after study begins. The Emergencies Act was passed in 1988, long before the composition of the Senate changed. It is the position of the government that all recognized parliamentary groups in the Senate should have at least one member on the Parliamentary Review Committee. As a matter of course, the expectation is that the committee will generally conduct its meetings in public. This committee, like all committees, can meet in private, but would usually only do so to consider draft reports or if confidential information is involved. The committee is only required to meet in private if it is considering orders or regulations that cannot be published in the Gazette. Let me turn to my closing remarks. Canada is a country founded on the principles of peace, order, and good government. Canadians expect government to protect our economy, the rule of law, our values, and most importantly, the safety and security of our people.
Honourable Senators, every senator who wishes to speak to this matter will have an opportunity to do so. If while a senator is speaking, there's a matter comes up that you want to question or you disagree with, please just take note of it, and when the opportunity arises, you can ask a question or you can speak to it yourself. Otherwise, please show some courtesy to senators who have the floor. Senator Gold.
Thank you, Your Honour. We select our government through democratic elections, not through threats or use of force. We respect individual rights and freedoms. We protect each other, as we have done throughout these last 2 challenging years. And when we disagree, we say so. Loudly, boisterously, sometimes angrily. We march, we chant, we wave banners, we vote. Sometimes we push the bounds of the law, and we know that there may be consequences for that. Allow me to quote the Prime Minister, who yesterday said the following, and I quote, "In a democracy, you can protest and you can share your opinion at the top of your lungs. You can disagree with elected officials, and you can definitely disagree with me. But you can't harass your fellow Canadians who disagree with you. You can't hold a city hostage. You can't block a critical trade corridor and deprive people of their jobs. You can't attack journalists for reporting, which is essential to our democracy. What you can do is vote. What you can do is run for office. That's how change happens in a democracy." Close quote. When we're at our best, we listen to each other, and without a doubt, we could all resolve to listen more and listen better. But on that point, though, this weekend, as police were advancing, one of the demonstrators was saying on TV that he only came to Ottawa to engage in dialogue. If only someone would have dialogued with him. Well, perhaps that individual did come here in good faith. But on the whole, to the question of whether this could have been de-escalated through discussion, when you show up waving banners, directing profanity at the Prime Minister, calling him for him to be jailed, and explicitly demanding the overthrow of a democratically elected government, that is a curious way to signal interest in constructive conversation. Organized activities designed to destabilize our democracy have been underway across this country for weeks. They are coordinated, well-funded, and persistent. Many participants have been prepared to use unlawful means and violence to achieve their ends. There is no reason to assume that those behind this movement have abandoned their plans to disrupt and destabilize our country. We cannot let this continue. The temporary measures put in place under the Emergency Act have already made a material difference in restoring order. While the use of the Act is extraordinary, the measures themselves are not extreme. They have been designed and used in a focused and a proportionate manner, and they have been effective. But even though calm is being returned to the streets of Ottawa, the need for these temporary measures remains. We need to let police and other authorities finish the work that these measures have allowed them to undertake. And you get the feeling that the people of Ottawa understand this all too well. On Sunday, for the first time in almost a month, the residents and workers of downtown, our hosts when we come here to the Senate, were able to walk around their neighborhoods feeling, I'm searching for the word, free. But not quite feeling safe, not yet. On Friday, Ottawa's emergency lines were deliberately jammed once again. On Saturday, the Ottawa hospital went into lockdown because of a bomb threat. And a number of demonstrators have regrouped down the highway and are vowing to return. As one man told La Presse, et je cite, "C'est pas fini."
And I quote, "It isn't over. As soon as we can, we'll go back."
Obviously, the emergency measures we're debating are temporary. They'll have to end before long. But it's only been a couple of days since a phalanx of police officers from across the country were required to uproot a siege in this city. Police are saying that they need a bit more time to consolidate the work they did this weekend, and I think we should give it to them. Honourable colleagues, I humbly ask for your support to confirm the declaration of emergency that is put before you. Thank you for your kind attention.
Senator Gold, there are a number of senators who wish to ask questions. Are you prepared to take some questions?
Of course.
Hey, Senator Platt.
Thank you, Your Honor, and I have a number of questions, so I'll ask one or two as you allow, and then ask to be put back on the list for questions later. Senator Gold, you said the government had been very clear. The government has been anything but very clear.